Hey everybody, and welcome to C1 Insider, your resource from CreativeOne for staying up to date on all tax, legal, and legislative changes that could affect you, your practice, and your clients. Today, we are going to dive into the DOL Fiduciary Rule. Before we get into that, I want to remind you that down below, you're going to see a link to a webinar that we did where we go into this with a fine-tooth comb. You're going to want to hit that link to really dig into the rule. But to get a Cliff Notes 10,000-foot view, I am joined by Andrew Payne, our Chief Legal Counsel. Andrew, welcome, sir.
Good to be here, Dennis.
Now, you're here, which means we've got to dive into the DOL Fiduciary Rule. So, Andrew, where are we at?
Right, so 2 weeks ago, the Department of Labor published a final fiduciary rule, the final version of the rule, and this rule applies to rollovers. So rollovers dealing with 401ks and IRAs and even IRA to IRAs. So if you do a rollover into an annuity product, it will trigger fiduciary status, which has a whole host of obligations that go along with it.
Now, and when we're talking fiduciary status, that we're talking about the independent advisor, the independent insurance producer.
Right, and so that's primarily who we're focused on. We're focused on that person who's out on their own, who's not a captive agent, who's an independent agent. And so for an independent agent like you watching, you'll need an exemption to receive compensation if you are a fiduciary. And so we turn back to our old friend, PTE 8424.
8424. What's PTE stand for anyway?
Prohibited Transaction Exemption. So we'll call it PTE 8424 or 8424 here on out. There's been several amendments that have been made by the Department of Labor that you'll have to comply with in order to receive compensation. And we'll hit those in more detail in a moment, but briefly, there are multiple carrier requirement, the impartial conduct standards, and the disclosure obligation.
Okay, so one thing that I saw when we were prepping for this is the fact that now you have to be licensed with more than one insurance carrier. Can you walk us through that?
Right, so they've defined the independent insurance agent as someone who can sell from multiple carriers. And so they've made that as a requirement. You have to have two or more carriers that you're authorized to sell with. And so I would imagine that most of you watching have multiple carriers, but if you don't, before this rule goes into effect, you'll need another carrier.
Okay, so we've established that your 8424 world that you said is amended, more than one carrier, but let's talk about the impartial, having to comply with the impartial conduct standards.
There's three parts to the impartial conduct standards. The first are the duties of care and loyalty. So the duties of care are that you've done your homework, that you've done your research on the client, and then applied the needs of the client to what the recommendation is. And the second one is the duty of loyalty. So you're not putting your interests ahead of the client. And so that's more of a compensation question. If product A is worse for the client but gives you more compensation, they would say that would violate the duty of loyalty if you recommend that product.
Okay, so you mentioned the compensation word, which is Pandora's box with this rule, isn't it?
Sure. Well, the next one is that you cannot receive more than reasonable compensation, and this is kind of a double-edged sword here. So, in terms of reasonable compensation, there's not really a definition of what that means. It's kind of an interpretive word that could go a bunch of different directions. Mm-hmm. That being said, the Department of Labor also walked back from the proposal what types of compensation the independent insurance agents could receive. Before, it was more prohibitive, but now they can receive cash and non-cash compensation beyond just insurance commissions. So they can receive potentially some revenue sharing, some marketing credits, some non-cash elements. So that is a win for the industry in terms of what is allowed, but all of that compensation package that an agent receives still has to be governed by the term reasonable, and all that compensation has to be reasonable. We'll figure out what that means down the road. Mm-hmm. That's something that carriers and agents are going to have to wrestle with in terms of what that means. If I had a crystal ball, I would imagine that it wouldn't change a whole lot, but maybe around the edges there's going to be some changes made there, but certainly something to look out for.
Now there's the last part here, which always confuses me because it seems almost like it just should be a given, which is no materially misleading statements. Right,
and I think that I'd just highlight here, okay, so it says no materially misleading statements. I think it's just as important and more important now to work with your IMO on your advertising, to make sure that it's approved, to make sure it's up to date, to make sure that there's no statements in here that could run afoul of the impartial conduct standards.
Okay, so that takes us then, the one thing I know about legislative changes and rule changes is that always It just always seems to mean more disclosure. So what do we have going on there?
Lots more disclosures. There's 6 elements, and some of them are standard language, but I'm going to highlight some of the ones that are going to be the biggest lifts for independent agents. And the first one is that upon request, you have to provide your compensation expressed as a percentage or range. So a couple differences here. It's only upon request. It's not every time.
And the old 84-24 was every time?
Every time.
Okay.
And also, you don't have to give the exact dollar amount. The exact dollar amount was required in the proposal. So put that away. It's just range or percentage upon request. And the next one I want to point out is that, and this may be a bit of a lift, is that you have to disclose all of your carriers and all of the products that you're authorized to sell.
And when you say all the products, so we were talking about this off camera, we're not talking about like MIGAs and FIAs. We're talking the accumulator 3000 and listing out every product offered by that carrier, right?
And so you'll need some help with that. It'll likely look like a booklet for some of you folks who have multiple carriers, and that'll have to be disclosed. And so putting that all together in a form that doesn't run afoul of the materially misleading statements, you'll need some help with that. The next one is the documentation of the basis for determination to recommend the annuity, and you've got to provide that to both the client and the carrier. Another element that we're not sure what the carrier is going to require here. What type of work are they going to want to see? Is it going to look like the suitability form? Is it going to be more robust than the suitability form? But they're certainly going to look for, did you collect this information from the client regarding their needs? And then does that information you collected match up with the recommendation?
Okay, so that takes us then, I believe, a rollover analysis is a big one.
Right, so this rollover analysis is, and it's the last element of the disclosure we'll talk about, is only regarding 401ks. This doesn't have anything to do with replacements, transfers, or IRA to IRA. It's just having to deal with 401k rollovers. And the biggest element and the biggest hurdle here is that you've got to provide the fee information from the 401k plan. So all those fees are kind of fickle and difficult to go find. You can find them in the 5500. CreativeOne will have a tool that will allow you to go locate those fees easily to the extent they're published, or we can do benchmarking from the record keepers in regarding to the information that will satisfy this obligation. It's difficult and it's different. It's on the security side that this is required. This is something that's been transposed into this insurance side that we're all going to have to get used to.
Yeah. Now, speaking of getting used to it, let's talk about dates.
Now, this is different. We were thinking that this was going to be 60 days from the publication date. So this is almost 2 weeks after. This could have potentially been 45 days from today. That is not the case. There are 2 dates that we need to look for. The first is September 23rd of 2024, and that is the first phase-in period. And in this phase-in period, the agent has to comply with the impartial conduct standards and give a fiduciary acknowledgement disclosure, which essentially says, this is a rollover transaction and I am acting as a fiduciary in this transaction. And that's the first phase. Some lingering questions on this one. What will the carriers require in that phase-in period? There's not a whole lot that's directly said in the rule regarding what is required from the carrier for the carrier to do to make sure that that independent agent is in full compliance. More to come this summer on if there's any changes. I don't anticipate a whole lot. There may be some attestations. There may be some additional legwork that you have to do. I don't know, but I don't imagine it's going to be like September 24th, 2025,
there we go.
Which is full compliance. And that's when all of those obligations, all of those disclosure obligations are due, and the policies and procedures that have to be put into place by the carrier are due. So we'll have some more robust discussions with the carriers regarding what they're going to require, but there's a lot more to come. We know a lot, but there's still a lot more we need to know. And
we do have the wild card of who's going to challenge this.
Right. So there's already been one lawsuit that was filed last week. We'll see what happens with I anticipate there being some more. And so really this is going to be for the industry 2 different work streams. There's going to be the compliance work stream where we all have to get ready as if this thing's going into place. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that. But there's also the other work stream of the litigation work stream. Is this thing going to survive legally? In 2018, the joint trades, and the Chamber of Commerce won the lawsuit, and the 2016 version of the rule went away. Is that going to happen again? Are we going to have a sequel to that? I don't know. But we've got to prepare in both ways, and at CreativeOne, we're doing that.
We're ready. Okay, so with that being said, remember, you can refer back to C1 Insider. Anything changes, we will make sure that you're up to date. Also, down below this video, there is a link to a webinar where Andrew and I get into the weeds, and by Andrew and I, it's mostly Andrew because you're the Chief Legal Counsel. But Andrew gets into the weeds. We take Q&A. It is a must if you're in this business. You need to watch it. So, with that being said, C1 Insider, your resource from CreativeOne for staying up to date on all tax, legal, and legislative issues that could affect you, your practice, and your clients. We'll see you next time.